As human beings move forward through the 21st century and religion continues to decline, we're forced to confront one of our biggest questions: if there's anything more to life than what we can see. In ancient India, the Buddha identified what he called the three divine messengers: old age, sickness, and death, as inevitabilities all humans must experience. Though in the future we may overcome these forces through technology, as well as the other horror of old age, forgetfulness, for now they remain the essential fates of all human beings. In the short term, we can experience wealth or pleasure, but everything is ultimately temporary and fleeting. Even if we achieve great worldly accomplishments, like Napoleon or Alexander the Great, over time our achievements will be eroded and forgotten, like the ancient king of Egypt, Ozymandias. It was for this reason that the Buddha counseled people to embrace renunciation, give up identification with the material world, and pursue the holy life. With this line of reasoning, the most mature end one could devote oneself to would be spirituality, seeking an answer to these questions. When we study civilization, religion has always played a central role for human beings. The earliest civilizations were founded on priest-kings, and those with knowledge of the afterlife, real or imagined, were deferred to over the centuries. If we study history, a universal is the ubiquity of religion. Whether the animist beliefs of native peoples, the Christianity of the Europeans, or the Dharmic faiths of the Indians, belief in the spiritual recurs everywhere. Two figures, Aldous Huxley and R.M. Buke, looked at civilization and made an argument for what they called the perennial philosophy, the idea of a kind of universal religion. The perennial philosophy states that religion derives from something deep in the human psyche, that it naturally arises, and that its outward forms are merely the results of the cultures or psychologies that produce it. If you examine the complexity of the physical universe, you do wonder if there may be something more than the material. There are, after all, many phenomena, like radio waves and infrared color, that exist but can't be perceived by our senses. Could it be that the human spirit exists on this level, having a reality in the non-physical, but not able to be detected by our current technology? Or are the cynics correct, and religion is simply a benign delusion, a beneficial adaptation that lets us cope better with the harshness of the material world? I studied religion for years, exploring Christianity, Indian religion, and esotericism, in search of the answer to these questions. After this time, I wanted to provide my conclusions, to help others navigate their way in the world. In doing so, I'd like to unpack the theses of religion and try to answer Pilate's question: what is truth? What is the highest end we can devote ourselves to? Part 1. Nirvana. If you spend time in the world of Indian religion, this is the central idea that all their faiths are founded on. In theory, you can be an atheist and accept this thesis, understanding it as a form of immortality, different from that proposed by Christianity and Islam. Nirvana is the idea that our individual sense of self derives from a universal self, and that it's possible, through spiritual practice, to transform one's state of consciousness from our ordinary state where you perceive yourself as an individual to an altered one where your sense of individuality unites in unity with the whole. When I was a teenager, I read the book Cosmic Consciousness by R.M. Buke, which is one of the places where I first encountered this idea. As a perennialist, Buke looked at the world and identified a list of great figures, prophets, artists, and mystics, and argued they all experienced, or partially experienced, this higher state of awareness that he called cosmic consciousness. On his list, he included Christ, the Buddha, Dante, Walt Whitman, Mohammed, Socrates, John of the Cross, Bartolome de las Casas, Paul, and Plotinus. He argued that these individuals all shared a set of common characteristics. After dedicating themselves to contemplation and the inner life for years, like we can observe in the Buddha's renunciation of the world, Christ's retirement in the wilderness, or Muhammad's meditation in the cave, around the age of 31, they went through a personal transformation. They all experienced a subjective light, a moral elevation, a sense of intellectual illumination, a belief in their own immortality, a loss of fear of death and sin, and a transformation of their personality that made them attractive to others. Buke explained this by making an argument about 3 states of consciousness. He couched his description in evolutionary language. He argued that in nature, living beings first develop simple consciousness, becoming discrete individuals, separate from the physical world. He argued that as animals became more sophisticated, they became self-aware like human beings, referring to this state as self-consciousness. If you've ever watched the recordings of animals viewing themselves in a mirror, this gets at what Buke is arguing about. Some animals mistake their own reflections for another creature, showing that they're conscious but not self-aware. Others, like crows, elephants, and humans, recognize their own reflection, showing they understand the concept of their own existence. Buke consulted his list of figures and made the argument that each attained, or partially attained, a next level of evolution, moving past self-consciousness into a new state. In what he called cosmic consciousness, their sense of individuality merged into that of a state of unity with the divine. This state allegedly brought with it a sense of immortality, enlightenment, love, and benevolence, as observed in history and the teachings of figures like Christ and the Buddha. If we unpack the different world religions, Buke's thesis appears in all of them, which for me provided evidence for his argument. In the 7th fold of Buddhism, for example, the Buddha counsels the cultivation of sati, or mindfulness, stating that if developed, it in time deepens into the state of samadhi, or enlightenment. Analogously, Christ counseled his disciples to keep watch, admonishing them in the garden when they fell asleep and failed to maintain the practice. With an esoteric reading of Christianity, one might view this as a lost practice of the early Christians. Beyond these references, similar ideas also appear in Islam as the idea of zikr, associated with the Sufis, and in Judaism as dveku, associated with the Kabbalists. Outside of these teachings, an Indian spiritual teacher, Ramana Maharshi, presented a similar argument. The Maharshi taught his followers to practice something called self-inquiry, investigating the origin of the I thought until it disappeared. If one did this, one would eventually abide in a state of inner silence. If maintained, he said this silence would then deepen until one experienced a state of union with the universal self. To give even more evidence of this teaching, we can invoke the writings of the Russian esotericist P.D. Uspensky. In Uspensky's writings, he describes a practice of self-awareness he learned from his teacher called self-remembering. He made the argument that if practiced over long periods of time, it would eventually deepen into a state of higher consciousness. These figures weren't motivated by a material purpose, wanting to sell their ideas for profit, but instead looked at the world's religions and sought to understand man's spiritual nature. Idealists, they came to the conclusion that there was something hidden in the human condition that could help us overcome the experiences of hardship and suffering. Parables and allegories. If we study religious parables and allegories, it gives us more evidence for Buke's argument. Christ tells the tale of the pearl of great price, something one should be willing to abandon all one's needs and desires for like a fool, to try to pursue. Something so great, precious, and excellent, it it would make all the other ends of human life appear worthless in comparison. When I read this story as a youth, it produced a great impact on me. It would be fair to think that the pearl, or Christ's kingdom of heaven, might be an allegory for a state of consciousness. In alchemy, a similar myth recurs as the quest for the philosopher's stone. In this tradition, the alchemist goes through stages of transformation, taking the prima materia, or first matter, and putting it through a crucible, turning their stone black, then yellow, then red and multicolored, until it becomes the transcendental gem of enlightenment. Another example from folklore appears in the tale of the Holy Grail. Pursued by those with knightly valor, it's acquired only by the holiest and most devout, those willing to sacrifice everything to acquire it, like the knight Galahad. Recurring in all these tales is that the quest for enlightenment requires great sacrifice and apparent foolishness. We can find more examples of this symbolism in the tale of Odin being crucified for the knowledge of the runes, or in the tarot cards, like those of the hangman and the fool. The meaning being that as a result of all one's noble efforts, one reaps the fruit of higher consciousness. This state recurs in most world religions, whether it's called Nirvana, Moksha, Fana, or the Kingdom of Heaven. This evidence supports Buch's thesis that a state of self-transcendence exists somewhere in the human condition. Having established this point, let's go further and unpack the means by which these traditions say this state is realized. Part 2, Asceticism. A word little known in our time, but something practiced in antiquity and the Middle Ages, is asceticism. An ascetic is someone who abandons the pursuit of material happiness, puts their faith in the divine to provide for them, and seeks happiness within. Asceticism itself comes in many forms. The Puritans. In the Puritan tradition, there is a personal God one is in a relationship with. If this is true, then each individual possesses a kind of moral bank account that one must eventually receive a reckoning for. If one gives up pleasure in the short term, then one builds merit in the long term, and in death, one theoretically reaps the reward of a lifetime of self-denial, experiencing the treasure hoarded that is not of this earth, that Christ alludes to in the Gospels. Alchemy. Another view of asceticism is alchemical. This is the view of esotericists like Gurdjieff. If one is self-aware, practices celibacy, abstains from expressing negative emotions, and silences unnecessary speech, then this facilitates a chemical transformation in the body. In theory, this process refines and perfects the spirit, allowing it to pass through stages of inner growth and development. Christian traditions. John of the Cross views the mystic as passing through a spiritual crisis, called the dark night of the soul, as he becomes more mature and approaches perfection. Dante views the soul as becoming increasingly purified in its expression of love, climbing the mount of purgatory as it overcomes the 7 deadly sins and replaces them with the 7 heavenly virtues. Others, like John Climacus, view asceticism as a kind of ladder, a training of the spirit as it ascends its rungs, in the process becoming more detached from the material world. Greek philosophers. A final ascetic tradition is visible in that of Socrates and Plato. The modern Christian perspective itself comes from them. For the Greek philosophers, one should live one's life in a state of self-examination, seeking wisdom and self-knowledge, and cultivating justice in the soul. Like in the previous traditions, doing this prepares the soul for death, allowing it to separate and function independently of the body when it dies. Having dedicated myself to this topic for over 15 years, and engaged in various forms of spiritual practice, I can share my results. Overall, I haven't encountered the state of cosmic consciousness, so I have to conclude that it doesn't exist. there is something to be gained from the self-mastery that comes from ascetic practice. In addition, I learned to silence my mind, as the Maharishi stated, providing relief from the constant chatterings of the inner monologue. However, this state never deepened into an experience of higher consciousness. While we have the examples of Christ and the Buddha achieving this state, one of the problems with the thesis is a lack of novel examples of enlightened individuals in the world. Given the total human population, if this state was universally accessible, but hidden beneath a rigorous practice, we would expect to see more individuals attaining or stumbling across the experience of higher consciousness. Thus, if we're serious about our spiritual quest, we have to move on to other areas and examine what else remains hidden in the human experience. Part 3, Other Mysteries. Ghosts. If we look at the question of ghosts from the perspective of the perennial philosophy, we might initially conclude that they're real. Stories of ghosts are ubiquitous in history, with ghost stories existing amongst native peoples, in European culture, and in Asian folklore. In a previous video, we looked at the Blair Witch Project and explored how in 1999, with the advent of modern recording technology, one would expect the first documented accounts of ghosts to begin appearing in the world. Since the 2000s, we've lived in the world of ubiquitous video. With no clear evidence of ghosts in the age of cell phone cameras, we have to conclude that if there are ghosts, they're not able to influence the physical world. Prayer. If we examine the concept of prayer, the central question would be its effectiveness. Whether one prays to Shiva, Christ, or Allah, one would anticipate an influence on the physical world. Even if it's subtle or indirect, the effects of prayer should be measurable. Unfortunately, surveys on it have found no results for prayer. Thus, we have to conclude that if the gods do exist, they either can't hear us or can't influence the physical world. I think this is unfortunate, because I think there's a benefit in developing a personal relationship with the divine. The triumphalist argument. An alternate argument when it comes to prayer is to look at the successes of civilizations to discern which gods are the correct ones. This interpretation would view the influence of the gods as subtle and indirect, but as providing over time a kind of providence to the cultures that worship correctly. This argument is how Christianity spread for many centuries, for instance in its supplanting the former gods of places like Mexico and Peru. This argument would lead us to think the Christian teaching is the correct one, given its hegemony over the world as a whole. At the same time, we could argue that the moral system taught by Christ resulted in the best system of social organization, and that its tenets allowed for the development of free thought and science, which resulted in the largest material improvements and the most effective forms of government in its areas of the world. It does appear the Christian mythos contains something deeply appealing to the human psyche. Christianity seeks redemption for the suffering, for the poor, and for those who are unjustly slain. It offers the idea of the conquest of death through resurrection, gained through heroism and noble sacrifice for the benefit of others. Miracles. If you read the Gospels, central to the early success of Christianity are the miraculous powers attributed to Christ and the apostles. Not only Christianity, but other faiths have these accounts. In India, the yogis are associated with the siddhis or attainments, which often take the form of psychic powers. Modern seekers like Uspensky didn't encounter healing, but recorded experiences of ambiguous psychic phenomena. If you read the Gospels, there appears to be one passage that describes the mechanics of thaumaturgy. This is in the account of the woman touching Christ's cloak, causing him to feel the power or dynamikos go out of him. The miracles associated with the life of Christ create an issue for us, forcing us to extract his ethical teaching from the miracle stories and interpret them as figurative rather than literal occurrences. There's an argument called cessationism, which is that the early miracles were real, but that these spiritual powers faded with time. While we can indulge this as an idea, logically we need to use Occam's razor and dispense with the miracle accounts as real. Revelation. Related to the idea of intuition is revelation. While we might conclude the miraculous is impossible, this still leaves the inner world of man as potentially open to the spiritual. If we study the different human civilizations, most of them are founded on the idea of revelation. The Christian world is founded on the Gospels, the Islamic on the Quran, and the Hindu on the Bhagavad Gita. Each culture has a revealed work that lays at the basis of their moral and social organization. As we stated previously with the idea of triumphalism, these civilizations have been some of the most successful, suggesting a kind of teleology behind this. We enter the world as a blank slate, and we find ourselves foundering, looking for a truth around which we can dedicate our lives. In our search, we look for the divine, hoping to surrender ourselves to the highest power that might exist. In the writings of Evelyn Underhill, she discusses the phenomenon of automatic writing, an experience in which the written word flows spontaneously out of the spiritual seeker, turning one into a medium for a message that feels like it's being communicated through you. A kind of inspiration, this style of writing gives the author a sense of divine agency. This phenomenon is likely the sincere origin of the Gospels as well as the Quran. While we can devote ourselves to this kind of writing, if intuition doesn't come from an external source, we can conclude it's a product of the author's mind and not the divine. Intuition. A more subdued version of revelation. Intuition is the idea we're able to receive guidance from the divine through our subconscious. This might manifest through conscience, through listening to an inner guide, through using a spirit board or consulting a medium. We find instances of this in Plato, like when Socrates refers to his daimonion in his trial, or in the accounts of the mystics, like John of the Cross or Francis of Assisi, listening to their inner pushes and pulls that advance them on their quests. Similar to revelation, if intuition does not arise from an external source, we conclude it's a function of the individual mind. Angels. If we use the analogy of a ladder, we can see a hierarchy of life and creation, and from it speculate on what a non-physical entity like an angel would be. If we start our ladder of life with plants, we find that many cells come together and constitute a single organism as a tree. Despite this, a tree lacks consciousness, and for this reason isn't an individual. Above trees come organisms that have consciousness, like insects, which become more complex and develop emotional lives, like sheep. We can then identify human beings who possess these traits along with self-awareness. If we take this chart farther and speculate on another class of beings, this is where we get the concept of angels. An angel would be a kind of self-aware intelligence that lacks a body. For angels to exist, consciousness would need to be able to exist independently of the brain. This type of being would have to exist for us to have a hope of surviving bodily death. Having dispensed with many of the phenomena that arise in the domain of the spiritual, we at last get to the question of dreams. One of the last pieces of evidence we have that there may be something more to life than what we can see lies in something that we all experience. Not only humans, but animals as well, like tigers and elephants, dream. Dreams happen in the rapid eye movement, or REM state of sleep, occurring in cycles during the night and happening most frequently in the period just prior to waking. Dreams have always been a domain of mystery for human beings. Dreams are necessary for the health of the mind. They can give us insight into life and our problems, and they are expressions of our unconscious desires and attachments. Dreams are also frequently associated with the spiritual. They're one of the alleged ways the dead can interact with us. They're also associated with prophecy and divination. Caesar's wife had a dream of his assassination prior to it happening, allegedly warning him and causing him to stay home from the Senate. Famous writers and inventors were also inspired by dreams. For example, the inventor of the periodic table. Today there exist two phenomena derived from dreams, lucid dreaming and out-of-body experiences, that constitute the last bastion of the otherworldly before we submit to nihilism. These phenomena are relatively well accounted for, giving us evidence for their existence. We can understand them as existing on a spectrum. At night, all humans and most animals dream. Some individuals experience lucid dreams, where self-awareness and personal agency enter the dream space. Lucid dreamers are able to experience their individuality during their dreams, and consequently mold their surroundings. Beyond this phenomenon, an even smaller number of individuals report what are called out-of-body experiences, which are usually described as clear as waking reality, or even hyper-real. In addition to these is the phenomenon of near-death experiences. People report this state when experiencing clinical death and coming back with visions of the afterlife. Near-death experiences appear a manifestation of the out-of-body state on death, suggesting a possibility this may be our fate when we die. What are dreams? These phenomena raise the question of what dreams are. Are dreams limited to the physical mind, or are dreams actually consciousness projecting into the non-physical? In the 1999 film The Matrix, when Morpheus trains Neo, he does so in a virtual reality world where they fight in a martial arts battle. After fighting, Neo catches his breath, and Morpheus asks Neo if that's air he's breathing. This raises the question of what existence would be like for a non-physical being. If consciousness can exist independently of the brain, then it would be a state of liberation, where thought could form the basis of one's reality. Induction. If we examine the induction methods for lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences, they are consistent across different sources. This shows that the phenomenon is universal, even if we still need to discern whether the experience is a product of the brain or not. Whether you use Bob Monroe, William Bullman, or other figures, they all explain induction as happening through the following methods. The direct method. In the direct method, you fall asleep and enter the REM state while remaining self-conscious. This is difficult because the brain usually passes through a state of non-REM sleep first. Thus, it's often recommended to use the wake-back-to-bed method when attempting this, getting up in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. before our most concentrated period of dreams, then going back to sleep, practicing it. The indirect method. The indirect method is associated with Michael Raduga, who taught it to his students in his lucid dreaming classes in Russia. He teaches people to become self-aware just as they're waking up in the morning, remaining physically still and having consciousness roll out of the body so it can explore a non-physical environment. Dream state induction. A final method is the dream state induction. This can be done by practicing reality checks during the day, or through making affirmations and saturating one's mind with the intention to be lucid when you sleep. If practiced, one can become self-aware in a dream, taking control of it and even transferring it into an out-of-body experience. Dream journals. If one experiences success with one of these methods, challenges include maintaining lucidity throughout the experience and then recalling the memories of the experience on waking the next day. One recommendation is to repeat what you experienced just prior to waking up, as well as dream journaling whatever you recall on waking. Problems. If you read the tales of out-of-body experiencers, we have to grapple with whether they're experiencing an internal state or if their consciousness is truly separating from the body. First, when one projects, for example in one's bedroom or apartment, it appears you're actually in a copy of physical reality. You aren't a ghost in the real world, but in a mental projection of your environment. This means you can't acquire knowledge about the physical world in this state, and it raises a question if projection is just an inner experience of the brain. Another issue with out-of-body experiences is that many people who do experience clinical death and return to life do not report near-death experiences. While I appreciate the thesis of Raymond Moody's book, we should expect more people to report them and for this phenomenon to be universal. Another issue is over the out-of-body experience occurring only in the REM state. If consciousness is separating from the body, what happens to our self-awareness during the non-REM stage of sleep? This raises the question of what the brain's role is. Is it a medium that interprets consciousness, or is it the origin of consciousness itself? Another problem is the logistics of souls. If there are out-of-body experiences, then we might assume reincarnation is correct, that on birth a pre-existing soul enters a body, gets amnesia, and begins a new life. Yet this process of incarnation would have to be highly flexible, matching the dynamic changes of populations as they grow exponentially or contract harshly to extinction. This also disrupts the idea of karma. If only tigers are born and one's karma requires a human incarnation, one wouldn't be able to be born at that time. This creates a whole confusing situation. While we could assume a vast spirit world of millions of beings seeking incarnation at any time, the logistics of souls in an otherwise atheistic universe is still a difficult question to answer. A final problem is past life knowledges. While there has been one study on this done by Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, which claims that children can remember their past lives early on before forgetting them, we should have more evidence of this if it was a recurring phenomenon. We should have evidence of this from diverse sources, of people recalling or intuiting themes from prior lives. Conclusions. When I was a teenager, I read R.M. Buke, Aldous Huxley, and P.D. Ouspensky, who inspired me to go on a long quest in the world of religion. Though I developed self-knowledge and learned to still the mind, I didn't encounter the state of cosmic consciousness. Despite this, I still agree with the Buddha's assessment of the human condition. I still subscribe to Christ's moral teaching, and I still appreciate the tale of Christ's death and resurrection. If it is an atheistic universe, I didn't spend my time wisely, but I did attempt to find the answers to these spiritual questions. The question remains if consciousness can exist independently of the body. If it's possible, we should focus on acquiring lucidity in the sleep state and recalling our memories in the morning, in the hopes this work might help prepare us for the death of the body.